Hi there. Last video, we talked extensively about the 8 elements that historians typically use to define something as a civilization. The things that we look for when we look at a human society and try to decide whether we should consider them civilized or a civilization. We're going to finish up talking about that, as well as some of the sort of follow up topics that are also covered at the end of Chapter 1, Section 3, that sort of follow up on these various elements of civilization. The first thing to talk about is nomadic civilization. You'll notice civilization is here in quotes. Okay. We know that most human societies that developed into civilizations were primarily living along rivers, because rivers, as you might remember, provided the water and the transportation and all of those things that were useful for the growing of a brand new human society, specifically the agricultural help that rivers provide. But not every human society, not every human group lives near a massive river that they can take advantage of when it comes to building up their agriculture. There are still lots of nomadic people who are living in areas where there are no rivers, such as steppes, for instance. You can see a picture of a steppe on this slide. A steppe is basically a large, sort of flat grassland area with very few rivers, okay, or at least no sizable rivers. Um, and these human societies were not able to develop in the same way that human societies that were built on rivers were able to. But it's important to note that while these nomadic people may not necessarily have the same elements of civilization that we associate with fixed civilizations, okay, because they're still doing the moving from place to place thing. So they don't have cities and their governments are smaller because their populations are going to be smaller, right? That does not mean that they don't display some of the elements of civilization that we talked about in the more settled groups of human societies that are found near rivers. Okay? So, nomadic groups, for instance, our textbook tells us, excel in things like the arts and sciences, even though they don't have civilization to the same extent that we see in the fixed settlements that are near rivers, right? So, you might come across a nomadic group that has extensive oral poetry or culture, their music, their weaving, their jewelry, their animal raising, all that stuff might very much be like what you would see in the typical civilization that we expect to find near a river, but they're lacking a lot of the other elements. Okay, so it's important to remember that to be called a civilization does not mean that you have to display all of the elements of civilization. Okay, you can have a civilized human society that is lacking a writing system or that is lacking architecture or is lacking, any of those elements, right? They're a set of rough guidelines, right, rather than a set of must-haves. And just because there are human societies today that don't necessarily stay in one place, there are nomadic societies even today in the modern world, in human culture. Just because those people are nomadic does not mean that they aren't civilized. It's just that they might not have the same elements, or they might have as many of the elements as we would typically associate with civilization. Also, it's really important to be careful about that word civilization and civilized. And John Green talks about this in some of the crash course videos that we're going to watch, or we have watched for the class. But we should always be wary of calling a group of humans or a human culture barbaric or uncivilized. Typically, that terminology is used in a way to kind of demean and be negative towards a group just because they are different. A lot of times, the civilizations in human society that have been called barbaric or uncivilized are really, that word is just being used to be demeaning towards that group, where in reality, they display all of the same elements of civilization that we see elsewhere. The obvious example is the Greeks, for instance. Um, who coined the term barbarian or barbaric, um, who were so negative in their views of non-Greeks and thought that they were all sort of worthless and useless. But most of the people that the Greeks would call barbarians were just as civilized as they were. So we should be very careful about calling groups uncivilized, because it's often just a derogatory term that really doesn't have any backing. Because when you think about the 8 elements of civilization that we expect, pretty much all human societies have those, although there are some nomadic groups that don't. Now, these civilizations, no matter how many of the elements of civilization they have, change over time. Okay. An environment continues to play a massive role in figuring out how are these places going to change. Okay. Obviously, because all of it's built on agriculture or based on agriculture, you need to have a certain amount of fertile soil. You need to have rain. You have to have all these things. So if you don't have the environmental helps that are going to allow for agriculture to continue, then your civilization is going to struggle as well. Natural disasters play a big part. You can over farm an area, although human civilizations do try to quickly figure out ways to avoid having that problem. If you lose your water supply, all these things can really mess with your civilization. And we will see examples of civilizations which were wiped out or had to move as a result of things like natural disasters. I'm thinking primarily of the Indus people, where their rivers changed course, and as a result, they had to abandon their cities. Um, but of course, these environmental challenges can also be a positive thing, right? So if a small environmental challenge appears, that can help to push people to develop new technology, develop trade, new ideas, new skills, right? Reacting to these difficulties can often be as productive as not having had those, or even more productive as having had not had those difficulties in the first place. So environment is going to keep being an issue. The environment never stops being an issue. It's still an issue today. We're dealing with environmental problems even today. And our need to react to those problems and be aware of them and fix them is something that drives technology and skills today just as much as it did back then. We also see changes in civilizations as a result of the fact that once human civilizations start interacting with each other, once they start interacting and sharing ideas, whether that's through positive ways or negative ways, um, we start to see that civilizations go from being isolated groups to sort of intermingled groups. And they start to mix ideas and they start to borrow ideas and share ideas and then improve on what they had previously based on those sharings. Okay? And we call this concept cultural diffusion. The idea that through things like migration and trade and warfare and relocation, the ideas that are found in one culture get mixed, incorporated, imposed, jumbled up with those of another group. And this is a really important concept for our class. We're going to talk about cultural diffusion all the time. So if you don't understand this idea, make sure you find out how can you figure this out or talk to me about it, because this is really one of the most important things. Okay. um, Human societies don't just grow up in isolation. The things that you think, the things that you do are all the result of some idea that has been mixed with or combined with some other idea, whether that's an idea from another human civilization, another human culture, in your own sphere, your own region, or whether it's something you've borrowed from somewhere else. Think about how many of the things that you interact with on a daily basis have some origin or some connection to a country outside of your own, right? If you're playing a video game and that video game studio is based in another country, or if you're playing it on a device that's built in China, or the phone that you have may have been built elsewhere and been shipped somewhere else, right? All of these things are kind of examples of cultural diffusion. Although it's not just about physical stuff, it's really more about ideas that we're talking about. But of course, ideas lead then to physical changes and physical stuff as well. So very, very impossible to really get a purely blank culture, purely American culture or purely, European culture, purely whatever culture. Because in reality, in the real world, all of those things are mixed together as trade happens, as migration happens, as warfare happens, relocation, all these things. The other thing that happens with civilizations is that civilizations physically grow in size. You may start off with a village that over time develops into a city, but that city then will start to take over more and more space for itself. And then the surrounding area of the city gets incorporated into it through conquest or through just simply annexing it. And as that goes on, right, the city starts to grow and grow, even though the physical imprint of the city, the physical buildings and everything might not keep growing. But the territory that that city controls is going to expand. Okay. And we typically call those things city states, referring to a city proper, like the downtown area, as well as the surrounding territory that it controls. Okay. Typically, the way that this works is that surrounding area is taken over by peasant farmers, sort of lower class farmer, agricultural people, where the city itself deals with all the other jobs that are not related to farming. And typically, then you have this sort of barrier of poor peasant farmers that are on the outskirts of the city state, who then send lots of their produce and lots of their food into the city, where it is then managed and organized and distributed by the rulers of that city, whether they are priestly or political rulers or some combination of the two. And of course, as city states grow and get bigger, then all of a sudden you're going to start getting more and more people bumping into each other. These different city states are going to start bumping into each other until eventually these growing city states, you could even call them nations at this point, start to come into conflict, right? Maybe these two city states don't get along. And now all of a sudden, one city state might take over the territory of another. Okay. And it's this kind of ambitious conquest, right? And that we start to see the now, instead of having just individual city states, we start to develop what we would call empires. So we have one ruler of a single city state who then goes on to conquer the cities, the villages, the territories of other places. But they're all controlled, even though they were all different at first, controlled by one new ruler. And this is how our textbook defines an empire. So we start with the villages at the very beginning of the agricultural revolution. Those villages develop into cities as we have more food, meaning more people. Cities grow and become city states. And then as city states come into conflict, rulers create empires by taking over, conquering the city states of other people. Okay. And we will see many, many empires over the course of our term. We will see basically lots of empires that rise, become very successful and powerful, and then start to fall apart and break apart. One of the most quintessential empires is the one that you can see kind of progressing on the screen here. This is the Roman Empire. So at the start of the Roman Empire, Rome begins as a single city that slowly expands into a city-state that takes over more and more territory until eventually Rome starts to go bigger and bigger and start taking over other nations. So you can see Rome's expanding into Spain, to France. It moves across the Mediterranean into Africa. And slowly but surely, Rome gets big. But of course, at a certain point, like all empires, when it gets too big and too difficult to handle, it starts breaking apart. And so you can see there, it splits into the East and West Empire. All of a sudden, the Western Empire gets getting smaller and smaller because it kind of falls apart until eventually you're only left with that Eastern Roman Empire. This is a typical pattern. Empires rise, get more powerful. At a certain point, they hit critical mass. They can no longer maintain themselves, and they start to fall apart. And we're going to see this happen many, many times over the course of our term. We're very commonly going to be talking about empires and their rise and then the reasons for why they fell. And this pattern repeats itself over and over again. So a good idea to get used to seeing this as time goes on in our class. So here, for instance, is the Roman Empire at its largest extent, right? You may have seen it in that animated version of this, but this is the Roman Empire at its biggest, and it all started just with a single city right here in Rome, and slowly but surely, all of these other places became part of it. But again, it fell apart. It divided itself in half, and then slowly but surely crumbled into almost nothingness until eventually the eastern part was the only part that was left. And it became something very different from what it had originally started as. There are a lot of pros and cons that come with empires. On the one hand, for the pro side, empires can end wars between neighboring communities. Although admittedly the reason they end is because oftentimes because of conquest, not always, but sometimes it is. Um, and empires bring very different, very disparate people. That's what disparate means, is basically different groups of people, different civilizations of people into a single group. So it can help to bring people together. Physically, empires often typically include an increase and an improvement in the amount of infrastructure that's found in those territories. So Rome, for instance, was famous for its roads. For instance, the Romans, everywhere the Romans went, they built roads. And other cultures were not necessarily as good at building road networks. But everywhere the Romans went, every time they conquered a new place, they would develop and build roads out into those places, and then they would start to build out other structures too. So becoming a part of the Roman Empire, for instance, could mean that physically your cities would get better and better, and your infrastructure, the stuff that helps to keep your civilization going, would get better and better as well. Um, this also leads to increased cultural diffusion, right? Rome incorporates Gaul, Spain, all these other places into its empire. And now Spanish ideas, Gallic ideas, all this stuff is bringing its way into the empire, and they're able to thrive and combine these ideas with their things and create newer ideas, things that are even better. Um, so cultural diffusion increases, and cultural diffusion is always great. It's always great to have. Finally, empires typically tend to have a much bigger impact on the world. You probably haven't heard of Gaul, which is basically ancient France, but you have heard of Rome, because Rome was an empire that happened to take over Gaul, right? So empires typically have a bigger contribution, more of an influence on the later world. But it's not all good. If your conquest, the building up of an empire, is military in nature, then of course it can be very, very violent and very, very cruel. Yes, Spain and Gaul and all of them are conquered, but brought into the empire, but it's very violent and bloody. Um, Empires also often lead to exploitation. You kind of cheat the people that are brought into your empire at first. So you might incorporate Gaul into your empire, but you also might tax them more heavily, or you might do other horrible, terrible things to them. Um, and of course, becoming part of an empire means you're losing some of your initial identity. You're losing something unique about your identity, right? If Spain becomes part of the Roman Empire, it starts to look more like Rome and less like Spain. But of course, Spanish ideas start to influence Rome. And so Rome starts to look more like Spain and less like Rome. Um, so if your national identity is very concerning for you, and you want to keep it pure, which of course can lead to all sorts of nationalistic and bad ideas. But if you're worried about the culture of your empire, then having this cultural diffusion going on could be looked at as a negative thing. Although, again, it's very nationalistic to kind of worry about those sorts of issues. So empire is both good and bad. There's a lot of negatives that go along with empire. But as far as history goes, as scholars of history, we're kind of grateful for empires because they do typically have a huge impact on the world, and they're something that really draws our focus. So we will focus on them quite a bit when we see them in our class. All right. So that's it for chapter 1, section 3, and that's the end of chapter 3, or sorry, section 3 completely. After this, we have all the tools that we need to start looking into actual civilizations bit by bit. So until we get to there, I'll talk to you next time.